Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to our podcast, Classical Discoveries. And I think, Jens, after this episode, we will have how you say, hello? A hello? I think a holy hello at all, because we are talking about this.
In fact, it is time for C.P.Eppreciation.
And what is a C.P. Eppreciation? Oh my God, I'm learning so many words from you.
Well, it's C.P.Eppreciation. It's a bad pun on the name of Philip Emmanuel Bach, C.P.E. Bach.
Ah, okay.
C.P.Eppreciation. The second oldest of Bach's many kids.
How many kids Johann Sebastian had? No?
Well over a dozen. How many exactly?
I think somewhere noticed 20 kids, but only 10.
10 survived.
10 survived, or get in the age of adults. And most of them have been composers, no? Or many of them.
Many of them, anyway. Yeah. The famous ones, the ones that we know were composers. Of course, it reminds me of the, true or not, one of my German teachers in school in Fargo told the story where someone had written an essay in school and about Bach, the father, Johann Sebastian. Johann Sebastian Bach had 20 children. He was an old master of the grand organ.
Okay. But he still find time to compose. And also Philip, I think he's the most famous one, no? from his kids.
I mean, he and who are the other ones? Wilhelm Friedemann
Bach.
And of course the London Bach.
Yeah.
Which is...
I can help us, because we once released this here a set of music of the Bach family. Of course, there's Johann Sebastian, Karl Philipp, Johann Ernst Bach, Johann Christoph Friedrich Bach, Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, Johann Christian Bach, Johann Ludwig Bach, and from before Johann Sebastian already Johann Michael Bach, Georg Christoph Bach, and Johann Christoph Bach. I mean, this is a syndicate. No?
Johann, yeah, well, I mean, if you were a musician, a city musician, a Stadtpfeifer, as they were called in the time of, say, J.S. Bach's grandfather, Veit Bach, that's what you would do in the family. Just as if you were a butcher or if you were a cobbler, that was your trade, and you would do that. Although it sort of started being less important with Johann Sebastian Bach, because C.P.E. Bach, among several of his kids, didn't initially set out to be a composer. Yeah. He studied law in Leipzig first, and then in Frankfurt on the Oder, the eastern Frankfurt.
Yeah.
And only when he proved to be too good at composing did his father relent and say, okay, well, I can't keep you from that. Go ahead, be a composer. It turned out to be a pretty good job for C.P.E. Bach. Johann Christian, though, I want to say, is the London Bach.
Johann Christian Bach, yeah.
And just as Johann Christian is the London Bach, C.P.E. Bach could be dubbed the Hamburg Bach.
The Berlin and the Hamburg Bach.
Or Berlin Bach, but that's, he spent, 30 years in Berlin, so he's just as much the Berlin Bach. But if you're going to fix on one town, probably go with the latter. Perhaps interestingly enough, because these musician families knew each other well, the godfather of C.P.E. Bach was Georg Philipp Telemann.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is then when when Carl Philipp went to Hamburg, he take the job of his godfather.
Exactly. He tried to get a job of his father when Johann Sebastian died in 1750. C.P.E. applied to become the new Thomas Cantor and was turned down.
Yeah.
As he was turned down from quite a few jobs that he applied for.
Yeah.
But then he was invited to the Hamburg position, which in any case was arguably the most prestigious music position in Germany at the time.
The Hamburg thing. Yeah.
Because you were overseeing the music for all of the 5 churches of Hamburg.
Yeah.
And you were constantly writing
And you have to imagine, just to come back to Telemann, that he stayed there 46 years as a Kapellmeister.
Telemann did, yeah.
So he must compose, I don't know, thousands of pieces. I mean, they needed really for each church service or for each holiday in the church, new cantatas, new passions, and blah, 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 and all these things.
Plus all the non-secular music.
Yeah.
Non-sacred, all the secular music they composed. And Telemann composed lots of works in Frankfurt, where he was before that.
That also changed very, of course, then in the life of Carl Philipp. When he stayed in Berlin with Frederick the Great, Friedrich the Zweite, of course, his most compositions have been flute concertos for Frederick, flute sonatas. So we have tons of flute manuscripts there, And then later on, when he became quasi the Kapellmeister in Hamburg, then he suddenly had to learn and to organize, as you said, for these 5 churches, all this church music. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, he was the chamber harpsichord player officially.
Yeah.
In Berlin.
Yeah.
And then his next job was the Kapellmeister for Princess Anna Amalia.
Yeah. Exactly for this I can tell you, because you also just mentioned that he wanted to be going to Leipzig to follow his father. There is an Easter cantata, Gott hat den Herrn auferweckt, from 1756. We don't know exactly. So in Berlin, it was not really the job of a cembalist or a Kammercembalist. What's the name? Chamber cembalist.
Chamber harpsichord player.
Chamber harpsichord player, what a visit card. Chamber harpsichord player to write an Easter cantata, but just to show to give you an idea how this music sounds that time, the church music of Carl Philipp Emmanuel sounds this time. We can listen now a bit to the beginning of this chorus from this Easter cantata. Yeah, but it has really something a bit like Telemann, no? This yumpa bum. It remembers me already.
Reminds you?
It reminds me already to such kind of pieces from Telemann. Yeah.
Yeah, it's it's a little closer even to Bach.
Yeah.
And when I say Bach, I always mean Johann Sebastian. Than you might expect from C.P.E. Bach, because, like all sons, he was a little bit embarrassed by the music his father had written, or was still writing at the time, this was just after he had died. Mm-hmm. Because Bach, even in his own lifetime, was considered to be hopelessly old-fashioned.
Yeah.
And a new time, Bach was already high Baroque, and his sons were born into the beginning of the Galant period, and are the prime exemplars of that period.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why when we think of music history very broadly, we think of maybe Monteverdi, Bach, Handel, and Scarlatti, who was also born in the same year as those two guys. And then we skip right over a lot of composers, and we end up with Haydn, and then we continue with Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Wagner,
Yeah.
Schoenberg. And that whole period between the High Baroque and the first Vienna school, the Vienna classicism, we skip over.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered, well, not always, but when I hit upon that music and realized there is a lot of music out there, why is it being ignored? Why is it not being played? It should be amazing. I mean, classicism, classical music is wonderful. Bach is fantastic. The melding of those two should blow your mind. And it doesn't really.
But I think maybe it's also the reason that we didn't have so much scripts available, and they just found it later on now.
I very much
between
doubt
these areas.
You think that's the reason? They wrote so much, they were so prolific, and we have the manuscripts.
Of course, now we have, but for example, only in 1999, there was this huge success that they found this huge library in Kiev, where the old library from the Berliner Singakademie. And this was more than 50, 60 years hidden because they saved it during the World War. They saved it somewhere to Silesia.
Silesia.
Yeah, and in another way, suddenly it appears to the library in National Library in Kiev. So they found this more than 5,000 pages or whatever. They found this library in Kiev, and that's why we have been able also to later on to save that and to record the Passions from Philip Emmanuel Bach. I mean, he always had to write nearly each year a new Passion. So they changed. One year was Marcus, then Lucas, then Johannes, and then Matthäus, whatever. It comes over again. So at the end, we should have already 5 or 4 Johannes Passions from Philip Emmanuel Bach. But anyway, there were scripts or there were copies, whatever, from his Johannes Passion from 1772. So already still more at the beginning of his Hamburg time.
Right, he came to Hamburg in 68.
68, yeah.
But to that point, I mean, these manuscripts were lost between the Second World War and 1999.
Yeah.
But the discontinuity that I had mentioned goes back further than that.
Of course, yeah.
And that, I think, lies in our inability to properly appreciate the Galant music. Certainly my inability, because I'd been trying to listen to it for many years.
Yeah.
And I was in Salzburg for the, I think it was the Mozart Festival, and they did the Resurrection and Ascension of Jesus Christ, and it was the Freiburg Baroque Orchestra.
Telemann or Carl Philipp?
Carl Philipp.
Carl Philipp. Telemann did the same. Okay.
And it was René Jacobs conducting. It was a beautiful cast. Michael Natsch was one of the performers.
Okay.
And it should have been so great. And I was sitting in there. It's like, oh yeah, this is long. And then afterwards, I met the then director of the Baroque Orchestra, and I asked him, "What does it take to listen to that music and truly appreciate it? Is it just because we don't know it? And if we only immersed ourselves so completely in that music and understood it fully, that we would then be able to understand it?" And he nodded very slowly, and we looked at each other, and we had the same idea at the same time, thinking maybe in that case the cure is worse than the disease.
Okay.
I mean, do you really want to listen to hundreds of hours of even C.P.E. Bach in order to then finally appreciate him? Since then, I mean, there's a reason that the classical period came about, and there's a reason the Galant period broke with what came before.
Yeah.
And for people like C.P.E. Bach and other composers of the time, other sons of Bach, Baroque was very structured and not very emotional and very rigorous, even though we may now think of Bach's work as emotional because they touch us, but structurally they're not that expressive. Yeah. And so they went all out. And hence you don't find sonatas with C.P.E. Bach. You find a lot of fantasies and free-form pieces where they gush forth with their emotions. Yeah. And it's very inventive. You have that word, inventions, is a word that pops up over and over. Yeah. But what it ultimately lacks possibly, arguably, that's my theory anyway, is the structure that lets the listener appreciate it more likely, more easily. Mm-hmm. Because once you have a certain structure and you repeat certain things, the ear can grasp onto that, and then it hears the second part, and even without knowing that it is a structure, you're led into the music. Whereas if it's free roaming all the time and emotional everywhere, eventually it sort of just, the steam leaves.
But there are a lot of emotions also in the passions, in the arias and so on.
The point is maybe too many.
Too many,
And too few strictures to sort of work your way through them. And the classical period then combined that. The liberties that were hard won by the Galant composers, put back into the structure of the sonata, of the symphony, of the trio form. In any case, it's still fantastic music. And Charles Burney visited C.P.E. Bach, the great English musicologist. And I found with him a quote that actually kind of reflects what and this is from 1780 or something. It must be owned that the style of this author, C.P.E. Bach, is so uncommon that a little habit is necessary for the enjoyment of it. And a little habit means a lot of listening. And
a lot of ideas, maybe.
And so once you get into C.P.E. Bach, it becomes more readily apparent why that's good music. And there are a lot of ways to get into C.P.E. Bach. You have, of course, this big old box there.
12 CDs of everything, but and then also, as I told you already, these passions.
Right. And this is mostly from the Berlin years, right? That contains a lot of the flute stuff. We've got this big old heavy box here which has all the piano works, or harpsichord works of C.P.E. Bach played on the pianos, 26 CDs. Once you've listened to all of those, you'll understand C.P.E. Bach just fine, and then you can continue with what we have to offer here.
But just as we talked about emotionally, I mean, in these passions, of course there was a lot of copy and paste from their own other works, but also they included at that time popular works. So, for example, the final chorus of Philip Emmanuel Bach Johannes Passion is the same like his father's Johannes Passion. It helped him also to compose fast, because everything has to be done fast for each thing, And I love, because we talked about emotion, a very beautiful emotional chorus. Attention paid to individual phrasing of any given musical phrase, rather than that line that goes through steadily in Bach, and in that sense it's more emotional. And also a very practical difference to his father's passions, Johann Sebastian Bach passions. They have been, really like big oratorios, But the Hamburg guys said no, they play the passion during a normal mass celebration. So he was asked to keep the music small, so maximum 1 hour, so that it doesn't get too long, the whole ceremony. Well, it's no different than his father, but back then, I guess 50 years earlier, it was easier to keep people in church for longer. Yeah, exactly. People didn't hear the passions of Bach in a non-church context either. It was, half of it was before the sermon, and the other half was after the sermon. And if we were going to spend 5 days in an unheated church, so be it. So most of the script, or most of these works, are 1 CD. That means about a bit more than one an hour. But it shows that churches became more customer friendly. Yes. It could be, Okay, but there are also then, he made this, this Aria furiosa, oder wie sagt man, die Furious, the Aria furiosa.
Sure, let's keep it Italian.
Finest Aria furiosa. I show you now a bit how Carl Philip made it, like his father.
Erkennt die Wichtiger der Götter. Sein Zorn brennt, sie küsst den Sohn. Sein Zorn brennt, sie küsst den Sohn. Ein schreckliches, ein tötend Wetter. Gibt dem Sünder, dem Sünder einst zum Tod. Ein schreckliches, ein tötend Wetter. Ein schreckliches, ein tötend Wetter gibt dir dem Sünder einst zum Lohn. Gibt dir dem Sünder einst zum Lohn.
So reminds me a bit of his father's passion, this kind of furioso arias.
Yeah, although I think if you listen to C.P.E. Bach and you're allowing yourself to be reminded of the real Bach, you're going to be disappointed. And if you hear some later works and you're reminded, or you're allowing yourself to be reminded of Mozart, you're also going to be disappointed.
Yeah.
One exception maybe, there are some, especially piano works, where if you think of Scarlatti, you won't be disappointed, because Scarlatti has the same sort of lack of structure in his works and has these beautiful miniatures. So, and that's the problem of the C.P.E. Bachs and his brothers and the like of that time, that we tend to listen to them through the lens of either the classical period or the Baroque period, and since it's neither, we end up maybe not appreciating as much. And once we can cast that aside, they emerge as something that's lovely in their own right, but it has to be played extraordinarily well. And I mean, that's to some degree also true for Bach or Mozart, although Bach sounds great even on the marimba.
And for Penderecki. So what are really the composers we ignored so many years between the Baroque and the classic?
I mean, primarily the Bach brothers. And then František or Francis Benda. Galuppi. Baldassare Galuppi. Beautiful keyboard works. Then you mentioned the clarinet brothers.
Stamitz.
The Stamitz guys.
Brothers,
That's Galant music.
But especially in Carl Philip, his symphonies, it's not our theme now, but in his Berlin symphonies you can hear already a lot of this, how you say, Galant, or pre-early or pre-classical period. And I found here in the sacred music a cantata where really there's an aria. It's like a Mozart opera aria.
Oh, that goes back to what I was trying to say, and then I lost my thread, where I mentioned don't approach C.P. Bach from either the Baroque nor from the Mozartian, but in this one you almost cannot think of Mozart as you hear early Mozart anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Just listen a bit to this early Mozart, but originally from Mr. C.P.E. Bach. Don't think it's Baroque, no, it's more
Well, it's not.
Il Re Pastore or something, an early Mozart opera already,
And that sort of cues up the famous quote that is usually mentioned when talking about C.P.E. Bach, where Mozart said of C.P.E. Bach, he is the father, we are the boys, those of us who have really learned anything have learned from him.
He really had a great respect. Mozart had a great respect for Carl Philip Emmanuel.
And Haydn did as well. Haydn said something along the lines of, anyone who knows me well also knows how much I owe to C.P.E. Bach.
And the interesting thing is, we are coming now also to this big oratorio. You mentioned already the Auferstehung, the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. Carl Philip Emmanuel was already nearly dead, lying in Hamburg, but he got the last one of the last notice that Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart conducted his oratorio 3 times in Vienna, and I think it must have given him also a great happiness. But
Possibly, or maybe he thought, of course he does. I mean, I'm his idol.
yeah.
Why wouldn't he?
So one job now in Hamburg for him was also to write a great oratorio, the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. Ascension. And the funny thing is that Telemann did the same with the same libretto of Karl Wilhelm Rammler, the same libretto 1760, and Carl Philipp did it in 1777. Yeah. And this, as we already mentioned, was this where Mozart was also so fascinating. It must be really a very popular work that time for Easter. There is a beautiful, heart-touching duet.
Heartwarming.
What is it?
Oh, it's the Ascension and the Resurrection Ascension of Jesus.
Ah, okay.
Oh, it's just the wrong label.
Ah, okay. So we hear now the correct, the right label, the better version. I like it when the harmonies are really sometimes strange between the two voices, you know.
Yeah, he's teasing you a little bit.
Yeah, it must have really sound for that time very modern.
Shockingly so, or
shockingly well.
everything else old-fashioned.
Yeah.
And again, to go back to Charles Burney, he at the time already said that our authors' works are more difficult to express than to execute.
Okay.
In other words, you can play them, that's not the problem.
No.
But the way you play them, that's how you get it across. And he was fascinated by C.P.E. Bach as a performer.
Yeah. But on the other side, we know that the choirs or the orchestra in Hamburg during the Bach time, they were not so.
Well, they were technically not proficient in
Yeah.
any way comparable to our days, but that's true for any period. I mean, same with Beethoven or Mozart or the real Bach. That is kind of irrelevant. You have to have the style down. And if you have the style down, well, then the technical element is a bonus. But if you have the technical thing down, but you miss the style, then you're missing the composition. And I think that has also hampered the Galant composers for a long time, because they were simply being approached from either end of that period, and neither of them does them justice. Let's maybe give C.P.E. Bach himself the last word.
Okay.
Because he wrote in his autobiography, which is somewhat fascinating, "On this occasion, I must point out that certain critics very often treat the compositions that they review too mercilessly, because they don't know the circumstances, the prescriptions, the occasions under which they were created."
Yeah, was für ein wahres Wort. What a right word.
Truer words were never spoken.
True words, Mr. Critic.
So he foresaw critics being completely ignorant of the circumstance and then just saying, "Oh, what's this?"
Okay.
He's humbling me.
Yeah.
I've learned.
So, ladies and gentlemen,
Anyway.
if you like to listen something different than for your Easter ceremony at home or Easter dinner or whatever, we recommend you now warmly Carl Philip Emmanuel Bach. Thank you that you join us, and we say goodbye with another huge choir von jedem Haus.
And happy Easter.
Yeah.